moving forward. So we will briefly look at overview of these key concepts, which include descriptions and language preferences, principles, and SNOMED CT translation principles. So let's first look at descriptions and language preferences. Besides from the specific term, each description represented in the description file also includes additional information and about the description, including an indication of the description type. For example, whether the description is of type fully specified name called FSN or a type synonym. The FSN represents a unique, unambiguous description of a concept's meaning, as we mentioned before. The FSN is not intended to be displayed in clinical records, though, but it is instead used to disambiguate this distinct meaning of each different concept. This is particularly useful when different concepts are referred to by the same commonly used word or phrase. Each concept can have only one FSN in each language or dialect. A synonym represents a term that can be used to display or select a concept. A concept may have several synonyms, as we showed before. This allows users of SNOMED to use the terms they prefer to refer to a specific clinical meaning. Concepts can have multiple synonyms, and the associated terms are not necessarily unique. Therefore, two concepts can have the same synonym term. Interpretation of a synonymous term, therefore, depends on the concept to which the specific synonym is associated to. Each concept can have only one FSN in each language, as we said, or dialect. Each concept has one synonym which is marked as preferred in a given language, dialect, or context of use. This is known as preferred term and is a word or a phrase commonly used by clinicians to name that concept. In each language, dialect, or context of use, one and only one synonym can be marked as preferred. Any number of other synonyms that are valid in a language, dialect, or context of use can be marked as acceptable. This slide illustrates how descriptions may be marked preferred or acceptable in one language. Whereas this slide illustrates how other descriptions describing the same SNOMED CT concept may be marked preferred or acceptable in another language. To distinguish the descriptions that are preferred for each concept from the other acceptable descriptions, a language reference set uses an additional column called acceptability, whose value is set to either preferred or acceptable. This means that different languages, different dialects, and even different clinical specialities can use their own preferred terms while still referring to the same clinical concept. First, let's look at why you may need to translate SNOMED CT. SNOMED CT is a comprehensive terminology designed to meet the needs of a broad group of healthcare professionals in a range of settings. An important aim is to ensure understandability, reproducibility, and usability. SNOMED CT serves as a semantic foundation to support data communication across a variety of people and stakeholders in the healthcare sector, and to support communications across organizations such as hospitals, departments, wards, and clinics, and also to support national communication and data comparison. Therefore, the terms used to describe each concept should be understandable, acceptable, and relevant to the clinicians and other stakeholders who use SNOMED CT. To make SNOMED CT usable, SNOMED CT serves as a semantic foundation that supports the data communication. And what I also want to make sure people understand here, that to make SNOMED CT useful in a member country where English is not the preferred language, SNOMED CT can be translated into a national or local language. These translations must remain faithful to terminological and linguistic principles, while at the same time may be able to produce national terminologies useful for clinicians in their daily life. So when translating a terminology, certain requirements must be complied with in order to ensure terms of high quality. The translation of SNOMED CT not only demands interdisciplinary cooperation and reviews, but also calls for defining and respecting specific requirements. The primary requirement for translation may be summarized as follows. The FSN should be kept unambiguous. The chosen terms should be transparent, meaning that they should be immediately understandable and self-explanatory. The translation should be systematic and consistent by using the same term for translating semantically similar concepts. The target term should be linguistically correct, and the terms should be psychologically acceptable, meaning that the clinician's preferences and practice should be taken into account. Unfortunately, these requirements may be often in conflict. Psychological acceptability tends to be an obstacle to compliance with several of the heuristics shown before. Commonly used and acceptable eponyms such as Apgar score or Down syndrome are at odds with the requirement for transparency. And the random habits of practices of using non-noun or using rather noun plus noun or adjective plus noun constructions challenge the principles of being systematic and consistent. For example, sometimes it may be appropriate to use a term which is constructed of two nouns, such as fracture of tibia, or other times it may be appropriate to use an adjective plus a noun, such as tibial torsion. For these reasons, not all SNOMED CT terms, either in the source language or in the target language, can be expected to meet all the requirements. In fact, changing a term because it does not meet one requirement may result in inconsistency with respect to another requirement. Therefore, the group responsible for establishing the rules and principles for SNOMED CT translation will face the challenge of defining general principles while supporting individual translation decisions, which are justifiable from a terminological, linguistic, and clinical point of view. Defining a set of national linguistic guidelines, including syntactical, morphological, and orthographic rules to support the translation is crucial. So in the next part of this presentation, I'll very briefly talk about the basic principles for translating SNOMED CT. The basic objective of any SNOMED CT translation is to provide accurate and ambiguous description of SNOMED concepts in a target language. Therefore, concept-based translation must be used. The essence of this approach is to ensure that any target language, word, or phrase chosen is an exact semantic representation of the concept being translated. This goes beyond a pure lexical approach to translation. Instead, the focus should be on ensuring that the translated term is an accurate representation of the meaning of the concept. An example of why pure lexical translation is not sufficient is this translation of the concept globe finding. In many languages, the term globe is only associated with the planet Earth. However, an understanding of the context and meaning of this term is required. If we explore the definition of this concept, we can see that it is a subtype of the concept eye, vision finding, and head finding. And furthermore, this concept has a finding site of structure of eye proper. With this information, translators are much better informed to translate this concept into the words used to represent the eyeball. As you could see from the previous example, concept-based translation therefore requires separating the concept from the terms. In SNOMED CT, each concept represents the meaning or the clinical ideas expressed within the terminology. The terms which are part of each SNOMED CT description are human readable representation of the associated concept. Each term may be used to represent one or more concepts, and different terms may be used to represent the same concept. Consider this example. Myocardial infarction. This concept can be articulated using various terms. For example, myocardial infarction, infarction of heart, cardiac infarction, heart attack. And also consider the term cold. This term could be used to describe different clinical meanings. For example, to express the meaning cold sensation, quality, or feeling cold, or as a common shortening for chronic obstructive lung disorder, or cold could simply represent a common cold. Here we illustrate the steps associated with performing concept-based translation. The starting point is always fully specified name of the concept, as this term represents the meaning of a concept in a way that is unambiguous and independent of the context in which it is used. Reading the FSN should be tightly coupled with a review of the concept's position in the SNOMED CT hierarchy, which involves checking both the concept's supertype and subtypes to better understand the overall scope of the concept. In addition to this, checking the concept's defining properties helps in understanding the semantics of the concept. This step involves checking any attribute value pairs which are specified for the concept. Case of any doubt, it is helpful to find examples of the source term used in context in order to confirm the meaning, especially for primitive concepts where the full meaning is not represented by the concept's defining properties. The next step is to identify the equivalent concept in a target language, to identify the terms used in a target language to express the concept, if necessary, also to verify the use of the target term in context. And finally, write the terms in a target language following the agreed linguistic principles. So this concludes a very brief overview of translation principles, and we can discuss the questions that you may have subsequent to other presentations that we will provide after this.